This is Aldborough, on the North Sea coast, where I do most of my writing now. But I was born in South Africa, and I find that wherever I go, I seem to carry around with me in my mind Africa. And in particular, one question has always haunted me. What is it that lies deep down at the heart of the racial prejudices that make my country, South Africa, the divided place it is? I do most of my work in a little tower from which the coast guards used to keep their watch. And even here I find my mind returns again and again to this problem. And it seems to me that the social and economic reasons that are usually put forward, although they are true as far as they go, never get to the common factor which must be at the heart not only of color prejudice, but of all forms of racial prejudice in the world. And for this I think one must look within, to the dark and shadowy places in human beings, to the region of shadow that lies in the human mind, and which we are for most of the time so little aware of. You know, it's extraordinary how obsessed the world is by South Africa. How countries like Sweden, for instance, which have no cultural or historical ties with South Africa, are far more interested in the conflict in South Africa than in Russia, which lies right on their doorsteps. And how even in a country like Japan, where I was 40 years ago, I found the Japanese, who were later to inflict on me their own form of prejudice, far more passionately concerned about color attitudes in South Africa. Now, there must be some reason for such worldwide interest. And I think the reason is because in some strange way the conflict in South Africa is symbolic. It is as if there in South Africa the world sees, as in a theater, the tensions which are deep in the heart of modern man. And I think this lies at the root of color prejudice in my country. I was back in South Africa recently to lecture at the University of Natal, and found myself returning to the origins of this problem and to those first Dutch settlers who landed at the Cape. I defy anybody to prove that the people who landed at the Cape of Good Hope in 1652 had any color prejudice. If they had, there would not be that wonderful community of the Cape colored people whom we have at the Cape today. Because I assure you, ladies and gentlemen, they're not there by a process of spontaneous generation. They are not test tube babies. They are people whom we, in a moment, I think, which is to our credit, had no horror of black skins. And we could see beauty in people of the other races and color. We produced them, and a great many more of us that can care to admit it, carry some of that dark blood in our veins, and we ought to be proud of it. I think when I was growing up on my parents' farm in the Orange Free State, mine was an old Afrikaans family which had come there with the first trekkers. Color was never any problem for me. In fact, like this child and most Afrikaans children even today, I was largely brought up by the many black, brown, and copper-colored people who used to live and work on our farm. And when I look back on my childhood, I had nothing but pleasure and delight in the presence and nearness of the colored people of my country. And there was no such thing as an inborn prejudice or dislike or fear of people with different skins. That is something that happens to people later in life. On the contrary, to the natural spirit, color is a source of delight,
and I used to love the differences of shade in the human race. They seemed to me to enrich life. These were the fairy tale characters of my childhood, the really marvelous people one never forgets. And not even my parents, much as I loved them, could rival the immense sense of romance and fun there was for me in the dark peoples of Africa. I was hardly aware of colour as a problem at all until at the age of 17 I came to Durban, the great port that lies in the midst of the Zulu country. I remember how when I got there, the statue of Queen Victoria in the town centre seemed so ridiculous to me that I couldn't resist climbing up and painting her neck black one night, and found myself spending a night in jail for my pains, for Durban was proud of being the most English of cities in Africa. Durban is to this day a wonderful meeting place of races, not only of African tribesmen of all kinds, but also of Indians and Pakistanis who've lived there for years. And I found myself that the people to whom I was most drawn, to whom I felt closest, were not the English-speaking Europeans. I spoke the most diffident of English, because Afrikaans, after all, was my language, but the Zulus. And I think that if I had a problem at all, it was that I didn't like my own white skin very much, and that I felt myself to be a sort of white-black man. I used to find myself looking with longing at the Zulu boys coming down from the hills above the harbour, where the rich people of Durban lived and where they worked as servants. Most of them had guitars, and they seemed to me to have a great dignity, to be a kind of royalty, as they marched down to the sea with the step of a king, playing tunes of their own invention. And I felt myself to be very close to them. They seemed like brothers to me. And then suddenly the thought struck me, how extraordinary that society won't allow us to be that it sets up barriers to keep us apart. How much richer, how much more fun life could be without such barriers. What is the point of it? What is the reason? And from that moment, I think I was looking for an answer. One of the things I did while I lived in Durban was to go into the Zulu country, into the Valley of 1,000 Hills, the sacred hills of the Zulus, very close to the city. And there I got a hint, which was extremely valuable. I went on this journey because I heard that a new prophet had arisen among the Zulu people. He was one of the loveliest human beings I've ever known. And when he met me, he said to me, "Ha, you are one of the few Europeans I've met who throw a shadow." Now, this was the greatest compliment a Zulu can pay a human being, because it meant that a human being is real, because only a man of substance can throw a shadow. And he went on about the shadow. He said, for instance, you see the shadow which is here on the ground beside me? When I die, the shadow goes up into the sky, and I go down into the ground. And from there he went on to say, what have the Europeans done to their shadow? Where have they put their shadow? Why are they so cruel? Why are they so inhuman? And I realized that in some strange way, the absence of a shadow in the European personality was connected with what he called the cruelty and inhumanity in the European spirit. The next clue to what lies at the heart of this problem came to me many years later when I was a prisoner of war of the Japanese, and when I found myself in the position which is the nearest equivalent to what I imagine is the position of the black man in Africa today. Because symbolically speaking, in our dishonored state, we were dark strangers. We were black people to the Japanese. And one of the first things that struck me in my prisoner of war camp was a look that came to the faces of my soldiers. Time and again, I saw some starved Dutch, English, or Australian face being beaten up, and a strange, dazed, bewildered, unknowing, uncomprehending kind of expression came to it, as if it didn't know where it was and what on earth was happening to it. And at the same time, there was another look, and that was the look on the Japanese who were inflicting the punishment. A look as if they were not really seeing us, as if they were in the process of executing us, not seeing us as human beings at all, as they were seeing us as symbols, looking through beyond us. And I wondered why these two looks were so familiar to me. And in a flash, it all came back to me. The first look, the look of the bewildered soldier, was the look which I'd seen so often on the faces of Africans in my own country when they happened to be beaten up by some crazy foreman. And the other look was the look on the faces of the Japanese, because it reminded me of the look on the faces of the judges and the magistrates in my own country who sentenced the black people, who looked past them just as the Japanese looked past us, as if they were afraid that if they looked at the person they were condemning and hurting, they might see the person for what he was, not a symbol, not the carrier of darkness, but some bewildered human being. And there I thought I had it at last. And I realized that at the heart of prejudice there was a process of self-rejection. That in some strange way, the self which we despised in ourselves, the self which we rejected, became some horrible kind of dark stranger to us. And that this stranger, this darkness, this shadow, we project it onto the other human beings in our lives. We project on the black man in Africa, and we make him the carrier of the sin, as it were, in ourself. And instantly I went back further to something which I'd seen over and over again in Africa when I was a child. We used to have a lot of baboons on the place where I lived, and we would play a game of mirrors with them. We would allow them to get a mirror into their hand, and the baboons would take up a mirror and they would look into the mirror, and they could not believe that the face staring back at them was their own face. They seemed to think that there was another baboon there looking at them, and they would look behind the mirror and of course saw nothing at all. And this process of not finding the other person, this process of refusing to accept their own reflection, drove them so angry that they would pick up the mirrors and smash them. And I thought this was precisely what the Japanese were doing to us. We were their mirror, and they were destroying us. And this, I thought, is what we were doing to the dark people of the world, to the dark people of Africa. Really, if you look at it from the outside, as I come back to this country every year, and I see what people are doing, it just looks mad, it looks bonkers that people can behave in the way that our government's behaving. It makes no sense at all in terms of fear of numbers or anything. It only makes sense to me in terms of this irrational invasion. The same sort of, it's almost as if they are sleepwalkers, as if they are part of the process which made Hitler say so significantly before the war, "I go the way fate has pointed me, like a man walking in his sleep." And it's almost as if the people who are in control in this country are going the way fate has pointed them, like people walking in a nightmare of their sleep. And I think it's only if you look at it in this way that the thing begins to make sense. Because these people are puppets. These great powers are puppets of some irrational mechanism. And the sooner we realize and wake up to that, the better. Of course, it's rather comfortable to point to South Africa, but Europe has been swayed by these same forces. They took over, for instance, in the city of York, where in the Middle Ages the entire Jewish population was wiped out. Because deep down there is no difference between anti-Semitism and color prejudice. The Jew performed for Europe exactly the same mirror-like service which the black man performs in South Africa today. He took on the shadow, the rejected aspect. He shouldered the blame for the Christian's failure to fully live out his own Christianity. And it's significant how he was always thought of as a particularly dark and swarthy person. And here at York in 1190, we had a terrifying demonstration of how this split can work in the mind of man. Here, where Clifford's Tower still stands, between 1,000 and 2,000 Jews were driven to take refuge. The crowd besieged them there for 3 terrible days, until the Jews, men, women, and children, committed mass suicide, and the few who did not were torn to pieces by the crowd. And one of the greatest and most learned Jewish communities in the whole of Europe perished utterly. From that day to this, no more than a handful of Jews have ever returned to York. Now, if we go back to the beginnings in South Africa, we find, I think, that at first there was no color prejudice at all. Jan van Riebeck, who founded the colony, advised his first colonists to take Hottentot wives if necessary, and there was a great deal of mixing between the races, and so we get the Cape-colored population of today. But as the settlers moved inland and came to feel remote from the administration in Holland and to despise central control, they took their values more and more from the church. And this church happened to belong to Calvinism, the extreme right wing of the Reformation. And from that moment, this fear, this hatred of blackness began to appear. Of course, it could dress itself up in excellent reasons, because one of the most distinctive marks of rational man is that he can always find a good reason for a bad action. It disguised itself as a war for frontiers, for grazing lands, for survival. History is full of that sort of thing. But the real reason lay within the spirit of the colonists, for they turned to John Knox of Scotland, Calvin's most ardent disciple, for their inspiration. And from the beginning, Calvinism was just about the most coldly rational and narrow concept of Christianity there has ever been. From the start, the Reformation had been quarreling with the symbolism of Christianity, with all that connected it with the ancient, vanished pagan world of Europe. And they had been ejecting the virgin, the feminine, all that stood for the natural, instinctive, caring values from their churches. And as they did so, the split in themselves grew sharper, and the rejected aspects, the shadow, all those things that they had thrown out of their churches and their lives, grew, because one always finds that the narrower the concept of good is, the greater the shadow. And so nearly all the early church fathers in South Africa came to be Presbyterian divines, from from the lowlands of Scotland, and Sunday everywhere became what has been called the great and terrible day of our Lord. I think that, just as my old Zulu prophet implied when he talked about human shadow, what human beings reject in themselves, what they don't face in themselves, what they don't live out, goes dark inside them and becomes symbolized by a dark person. And so the black man in Africa, instead of being the rich, vivid human being, which he was to me, and I think is to all South Africans in their childhood, becomes the dark person we fear in ourselves, we hate in ourselves. We are forced by our narrow Calvinistic selves to reject and suppress as sinful. Because this is the astonishing thing about human beings, that the thing they are least aware of in themselves, they are most aware of in their neighbors. The thing we fear and despise most in ourselves, the clue to it is that it becomes the thing we dislike most in our neighbors. And this, I believe, is the origin of color prejudice in South Africa and in all Protestant societies. And now, parallel to this, what interests me enormously is the progress of the rationalist tradition, which is particularly associated with France. One can take its course from the time of Louis XIV, who significantly enough was called Le Roi Soleil, the king of the sun, the king of light, the light of reason. And as one follows this progress of rationalist France throughout the 18th century that follows, one sees all the time a lengthening of the shadow in the human spirit. For I believe the brighter the light of reason, the darker the shadow it throws. And one sees the dark, neglected side erupting finally in that monstrous phenomenon we call the French Revolution. And the mode of execution chosen by the revolution was extraordinarily interesting. The guillotine, an instrument for cutting off the head, because it was the head, after all, that had done the harm. It was the head, the lodge of reason, which had done the injury, and the heads in France rolled by the thousand. And the whole of France went over into its opposite, and went under Napoleon on that wild white charger of his, went on a wild, mad, unconscious rampage all over Europe. But just before the revolution, a very interesting phenomenon had occurred. A man called Jean-Jacques Rousseau had produced another concept of the dark, neglected side of man. He had presented the world with his vision of the noble savage. And here, in the middle of all this emphasis on reason, came this very clear hint from Rousseau that reason alone doesn't satisfy the whole man, that it is necessary to speak up, as he did, for the shadow, for the dark, neglected side of man. And finally, when Napoleon was defeated and the forces of reason appeared to have triumphed again, we found all the romantic artists of the early 19th century repeating their warning against neglect of the shadow. There was Delacroix with that magnificent vision of his, of the black devil hovering triumphantly over Paris. There was Goya with his gigantic colossus, and those canvases of his of nightmare fantasies and dark shadows. There was Baudelaire, the poet of shadow, with his fleurs de mal, the flowers of evil. And perhaps most amusingly of all, there was Gérard de Nerval, the poet who was so submerged in the unconscious content of his time, was so much part of the rejected spirit of France, that he used to walk about the streets of Paris with a lobster leading it by a blue ribbon. And the people of Paris would say to him, "But Monsieur de Nerval, what are you up to in the streets of Paris, leading a lobster by a blue ribbon?" And de Nerval would say, "Well, you see, he doesn't bark, and he knows the secrets of the sea." And of course, there was Robert Louis Stevenson, who with that extraordinary intuitive vision of his to that divisive split in modern man, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. In Germany, once the rigid, over-rationalized mentality of Prussia had taken control, one can hear the dark charge building up once again in the music of Wagner. And once again, it's the fair Aryan blonde who is held up as the ideal. And in the absence of a colored population, the dark Jews and gypsies who are made to bear the burden of the rejected aspects. Wherever there's a doubt of what one is within oneself, one looks for a scapegoat in the world outside. And I think this explains the persecution of the Jews throughout history. One can see it in Russia as it is at the moment.
Just at this moment, in Russia, a country which I visited myself, where I was horrified to find, when I was there, how anti-Semitic it was, how the Jews were being persecuted. And you must have read in the papers yourself how this process is accelerating, and how the Jews and the gypsies, just as in Nazi Germany, are more and more being persecuted in Russia today. I could tell you a long story about that, but why I'm mentioning it this is that Russia is a form of Calvinism. It's economic Calvinism. It's the nearest approach. It is a faith. It's the nearest approach, dialectical materialism, to give it its euphemistic name, is a form of economic, of social Calvinism. Here you've got an extremely dogmatic system in command, almost like the system in South Africa, where apartheid is now a great axiom. It's a holy axiom. It cannot be questioned. You accept it, it's infallible, and then everything logically proceeds from that. In Russia, the state is a mystic entity, and you cannot question that. But as the inner doubt among Russians, and it's considerable, I could tell you such a story about Russian writers and intellectuals and artists I met. As the inner doubt in these people increase, as their own shadow of their one-sidedness darkens and lengthens, they've started reprojecting it onto the Jews and the gypsies. And the persecution of the Jews and the gypsies, as the doubt grows, the persecution increases. And this is the process which I think was at work in European history. People automatically react like ripples on a pond.
In fact, I think that we are at a very interesting moment, and not only in Russia and South Africa. I think we are at one of the turning points in the human spirit, and it enables us to begin to see a way out of the problem of prejudice, because the young in Europe and America are in revolt against the Puritan and rationalist traditions, They are swinging towards the opposite, and this is what the bright clothes, the long hair, the music, and the interest in all those things which have been taboo is about. And one can see the swing in one of its clearest forms in the very country, the very city from which the original colonists of South Africa set out, in Holland and particularly in Amsterdam. Here there is a fascinating reversal of the South African situation. The Dutch and Afrikaner of today started out from exactly the same point in history. Yet in this Amsterdam club, young Dutch and Surinamese from the West Indies not only mix freely together, but delight in doing so. One only has to watch them in places like this to realize that the Dutch, like many other Protestant peoples, are in revolt against the restrictions imposed by their own consciousness. And there are signs that the thing may be happening in South Africa as well. Once more, they are seeing in the dark man the noble savage in themselves. And that is why the young in Sweden, too, are so passionately interested in South Africa, because they see reflected there the struggle of the dark man in themselves.
If you walk through the cities of Amsterdam, you will be amazed to see how the shackles of the mind, these shackles of Calvinism that have produced so dark a shadow in Africa, are thrown away, and people turn to the darkness, to the opposite, as if it were a kind of salvation. We have here even a church, which was once a church of the extreme right wing of Protestantism, the Reformed Church, the Hervormde Kerk, which is turned today into a kind of youth club, where the youth can do almost anything that they care to do in the name of paganism and feeling and color, all those things which the Calvinists abhor. And there are many other manifestations. You have an enormous housing project where black and white live quite harmoniously together. The schools are full of black, white, and yellow children. And the whole thrust, the will, the effort, the longing is to bring people together in one great stream.
Almost everyone you talk to in Holland will tell you that there are still many difficulties, but the will to overcome them is there. The desire is for integration.
We see coming children in the school, and all we want is bringing them together, working together, playing together. We don't think it's necessary to lay any stress on differences between children.
In other words, color and race really are irrelevant to you. They are merely obstacles in the way of communication.
Oh, no, it's of non-importance what color they have, whether they are green or red or blue or never mind what color. They are children coming in here in the school, and we want to give them a good education. I think we must have the possibility to have every kind of contact with colored people or people of other races. If we are afraid to quarrel, for instance, with colored children in the school, because we have to think it might be discrimination or something like that, well, I think it's a strange situation. It's not normal.
The immigrants themselves are aware of the differences between the older and younger generations in Holland. Among young people, there are many interracial marriages. I talked with a Surinamese painter and his young Dutch wife.
The thing is, you have a lot of problems going on. Like, if you come here as a Suriname kid, it's one of the best countries in Europe, white man countries, for a black man to live. A Negro or a black man can say, yeah, I can live here. But this whole movement, if you call it, it's divided in two. You know, it's the older generation and the younger generation. The younger generation is very much positive, and they're doing their best. Anyway, let me put it this way, they remember your name. I mean, you're not, for a lot of young cats, and young girls and boys, you're not a black mass anyway. You're not a black wall.
Well, I think that different races always are attractive to each other. Well, I love him. I mean, that's...
In a desert, under the sun of southwest Africa, far from any centers of civilization, we can find, I think, another clue to the way out of prejudice. For what is happening in Amsterdam is not a complete answer. In rejecting the values which have become too repressive, there is a danger of simply swinging to the opposite. We need something more than that. And here on a great mountain called the Fire Mountain, we can find a clue to what it might be. It is not a clue which comes to us from one of the great and sophisticated traditions of the world, from India or China or the Christian West, though it can be found in these too, but from the humblest of men on earth, the African bushman. Here, in a great wilderness of rocks, can be found that very element which the Calvinists chased out of the spirit of Protestant man, which the rationalist chased out of modern man, which the dialectical materialist chased out of Russia. It is the vision of the woman, the feminine, which is always personified in human dreams and art, the feeling, the caring values, without which man is like a cripple, and which his spirit needs as this wilderness needs rain. However faded it may appear, this lovely ancient Bushman painting of a woman striding across the rocks, she is called the White Lady, is to me of immense significance. For in it we can see how universal is the need of the human spirit for the feeling, caring, loving side of life. And my mind goes back to a strange warning which came to a great Portuguese poet called Camões, not long after the very first Europeans had sailed round Africa. Camões had a vision of a huge, dark, half-Negro giant looming up as they rounded the Cape of Good Hope, or the Cape of Storms, as he called it. And the giant said to the Europeans, "I am the last of the Titans. I helped the gods to tame the other Titans, and for my help I was promised the love of a white bride of the sea. But I was cheated of my bride, and as a result I turned to stone. These rocks, these cliffs, you see, are my limbs, and I warn you that those who come after you will pay dearly for having broken so brutally into this hidden world I have guarded so long." That vision seems to me one of the great intuitions of mankind. What are the Titans, if they are not the great natural forces in man, of which Africa is the last reservoir? Why are these natural forces turned to stone? Why do they appear as dark giants, which threaten us with destruction? Why is it that the white image of ourselves, which we present to Africa, is increasingly being smashed as the baboon smashed his mirror? It is, of course, because we have denied the natural man of Africa and the natural man in ourselves, white love, white recognition, awareness, and cheated him out of his lawful home in our values. And if we look again at the white lady, we see that she carries in her hand a flower, no known flower, but a symbolic flower, the flower of what is truly creative in man, the flower of wholeness. And this then is the final clue, for our troubles spring from one-sidedness. In pursuing the narrow, rational and Puritan values of our culture, we have allowed too great a part of ourselves to become lost in the dark. And the danger now is that in turning to the neglected side, we'll merely swing over into our opposite. The signs of this danger are everywhere to be seen. For it is not reason that wants to be abolished. It's merely the tyranny of reason and the need for enthroning the natural feeling values by its side. Only in this way can man be delivered from a perpetual swing over into the opposites, from dark into light and light into dark, and so on, making him a slave of mere action and reaction. This is why South Africa holds world attention as it does, because it's the most dramatic visual representation of this basic conflict in the heart of man. It is not one opposite fighting another, but two opposites joined together that can make man whole and enable him to achieve a new flowering of his spirit.